Hello everyone, welcome back to Too Sweet MTG and welcome to another Commander video. In today's episode, we're doing our first deck tech for the Universes Beyond Doctor Who. Today, we're going to be looking at Golden Globe and Bafta Award winner and Academy-nominated actor, John Hurt. It is 2 red and a white for a 3/5 legendary creature, Time Lord Doctor. It has, whenever one or more other permanents phase out, and whenever one or more other cards are put into exile from anywhere, put a time counter on the War Doctor. Whenever the War Doctor attacks, it deals damage equal to the number of time counters on it to any target. If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. But he's not alone. What's a Doctor without their companion? And in this deck, John Hurt will be joined by Nickelodeon's UK Kids' Choice Award nominee, Jenna Coleman. Alright, sorry, I'll stop doing that now. So, we have the War Doctor and Clara Oswald. Why have we picked these two? Well, firstly, the War Doctor is just really good. For the first part of the card, getting time counters onto the War Doctor will be a large portion of the deck. Because it only happens when a card is either put into exile or phases out, we will be looking for those effects in every section that we have, from our card draw to our removal, from our ramp to our protection. The reason we want to do that is because of the second ability of the War Doctor. This is the payoff for all of that hard work. Because when the War Doctor attacks, it will deal damage to any target equal to the number of time counters on it. And then if a creature we've dealt damage to would die, it gets yet more counters. That is a really strong ability that will start snowballing super quickly, and will mean we'll be flinging around a ton of damage. And don't worry, we're going to run a bunch of cards as well to really juice that up. Like for example, by running Clara Oswald as our Doctor's Companion. It is 6 generic mana for a 2/6 legendary creature Human Advisor. It has Impossible Girl, which means if Clara Oswald is your commander, choose a colour before the game begins, Clara Oswald is the chosen colour. It also has, if a triggered ability of a Doctor you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. This does a couple of really important things. Firstly, both of the War Doctor's abilities are triggered abilities, so Clara doubles up the time counters that we put onto the War Doctor, and then also lets us deal another round of damage whenever we attack. The other thing that it does is it also lets us run black cards in the deck. This is a really nice bonus, as black has a ton of additional effects that care about exile, which is absolutely everything that this deck is after. So in terms of the plan, it should be pretty straightforward. Ramp early, get the War Doctor in play, protect it from removal, and then get as many counters onto it as possible. We'll then start swinging in and dishing out lashings of damage to our opponents. Before we jump in, how this video will work is that we'll go over all the different sections that you need to make the deck. In each of those, we'll give you a bunch of cards for you to choose from so you can really make the deck your own. Any cards we mention will be down in the description below. While you're there, please consider liking and subscribing. Okay, first up, we're going to talk about some specific synergy cards. These are cards that we're running primarily to put counters onto the War Doctor. First up, we have spells that exile cards from the top of either ours or our opponent's libraries. Cards like Chaos Wand, Guff Rewrites History, Ryan Sinclair, Sibylline Soothsayer, Ensnared by the Mara, The Day of the Doctor, Plargg and Nassari, and Fevered Suspicion are all awesome cards. They do all have an element of randomness to them, but the worst case is a couple of counters. The possible ceiling with these cards, however, is huge, especially the ones that affect each player. Each card that any player exiles will add a counter to the War Doctor. Each of these honestly has the possibility of adding so many counters, it will be super scary. And because of how these cards are worded, you exile cards one at a time, meaning that you get a counter on the War Doctor for each card. Next up is Norin the Wary, a really annoying creature that exiles itself whenever a player casts a spell or attacks. It'll then come back at the end of turn. What this effectively means is that we guaranteed us a counter on the War Doctor on every player's turn. We then have Mimic Bat and River Song's Diary. These both exile either creatures when they die or instants and sorceries when they're cast, importantly giving us the opportunity to get a copy of whatever is imprinted, all while the exile effects add counters to the War Doctor. We then have Urabrask Heretic Praetor. This gives us an extra card draw each turn in the form of exile, and then makes our opponents exile the card they would normally draw, only letting them play it that turn. This honestly can really muck up your opponent's plans, all while adding more time counters to our commander. We then have Dream Devourer. This lets us foretell any card in our hand, basically allowing us to spread the cost over 2 turns. Again, because foretell goes through exile, it adds more counters to our commander, which we love. We then have some cards for mucking up our opponents. First, we have Dauthi Voidwalker, which exiles any of our opponent's cards whenever they would go to a graveyard, and then lets us steal one of them later on. You then have Opposition Agent, which exiles a card whenever a player would search. And then on top of that, we get to use the card that was searched for and steal it for our own deck. Then we have some more cards that exile cards from our opponent's graveyards. You have things like Planar Void, Relic of Progenitus, Lion Sash, and Graveyard Trespasser. They're all great at just reliably adding counters to the War Doctor by using our opponent's decks as the resource. You definitely don't need all of these, but a couple of them are very nice to have. We then have Gisa, Glorious Resurrector, and Shelob, Dread Weaver. These exile creatures offer our opponents when they die, and then in some way or another lets us steal them. Really great at buffing our commander and turning our opponent's decks on themselves. We then have Prosper Tome-Bound. This synergizes so well with the deck that it's nuts. It gives us card advantage at the end of turn, as well as a time counter on our commander, and then also gives us a treasure whenever we play a card from exile, which is just so much of this deck. Moving on now to our card draw section, and we have some really cool synergistic options to go over. First up is Necropotence, and if I'm honest, this is one of the main reasons for playing black. This lets us replace our draw step with the ability to pay a life to exile a card to put it into our hand at our end step. What this basically means is that with our commander out, we're paying 1 life to draw a card and also put a time counter on our commander. And what's busted is that we can do that for however much life we have, meaning we can put so many counters on the War Doctor we could easily take out an opponent in one go. Next up, we have some instants and sorceries that give us some one-time bits of card advantage, specifically by exiling cards and then giving us access to them that turn. We then have some enchantments, with Outpost Siege and Court of Locthwain. These are just repeatable bits of card advantage, with the added bonus that they synergize with our commander. We also have Virtue of Courage and the Adventure Embereth Blaze. We'll get a counter from the Adventure, which is fantastic, but the enchantment is also just great, as if we ping a player with our commander, we'll get to exile and we'll have access to that many cards in that turn. We then have Laelia the Blade Reforged, which when it attacks, exiles a card, adding a time counter to our commander. And then itself gets a counter whenever one or more cards are put into exile from our library, meaning Laelia will get super huge super quickly. We then have Cunning Rhetoric, a fantastic card that if we get attacked, lets us exile a card from the attacking player's library, and then we just get to play it. Next up is our ramp section, and like with most decks, we need 8 to 10 bits here to give the deck the fuel to power us through a game. First up, we have Simian Spirit Guide. I'm not normally as much of a fan of one-time bits of mana in EDH, but because the Spirit Guide will also add a time counter to our commander, or let us rush it out earlier, means I do think it will be great in the deck. Next we have cards like Wayfarer's Bauble and Knight of the White Orchid. Great cards that can go and get lands out of our deck and put them into play. After that we have our base of Mana Rocks. You have your Soul Ring, your Arcane Signet, your Felwar Stone, and then your choice of talismans or signets to top you up to get to the 8 to 10 bits that you need. Next up is our interaction section, and we have plenty of options in Mardu to get to the 8 bits that we want. Remember to always run a little more if your playgroup is more competitive. First up, we start with exile effects. Cards like Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, Despark, Anguished Unmaking, Deadly Rollick, and Utter End not only answer our opponent's best things permanently, but then also add a time counter to the War Doctor. Honestly, we just get the best of everything here. We then have the Moment. This is basically a board wipe that allows us to phase out key creatures beforehand, so they'll come back in once we blow everything up. Fantastic in the deck, as the phasing will also add time counters. There are plenty of other board wipes out there in these colours that you can choose from. Ones I like because they specifically only exile our opponent's things are Settle the Wreckage and Winds of Abandon. Really fantastic options. You'll only ever get one counter, but you will be bricking your opponents at the same time, which is just great. Next up is a little bit of protection. We will need a decent amount of it in this deck, as if the War Doctor dies, the counters on it get reset, meaning we have to start all over again. First up, we have the classic Lightning Greaves and Swiftfoot Boots. Always solid at protecting any commander from any targeted removal. We then have the new hotness in Mithril Coat. Perfect to give our commander indestructible at instant speed. We then have Robe of Stars, a great way of protecting our commander by making it phase out. Or we can stick it onto a different creature to get more counters onto the War Doctor. We then have Guardian of Faith and Gallifrey Falls No More. These both let us phase out any number of creatures at instant speed. That level of protection and synergy will just be great. We then have some ways of protecting our commander in combat. Cards like Mother of Runes, Reconnaissance, Solemn Gate, and Iroas God of Victory all protect it so we can keep rumbling in without having fear of it ever dying. Then lastly, we have one of the best cards in this deck with the Ozolith. Basically with this in play, if the War Doctor dies, we can move the time counters onto the Ozolith. Then when we recast our commander, we can just move the time counters back, basically picking up where we left off. Okay, so we have the base of the deck, let's go over some dedicated ways of winning the game. First we have Lizelle, Vlaakith's Champion, and Norn's Choirmaster. These both in different ways quickly boost up the amount of counters that our commander gets. When we boost up the counters, we boost up the damage all the higher. Another way of raising up that damage the War Doctor is throwing around is with Ishin, Two Heavens as One. This will double up that pinging triggered ability, so we get to do it twice every time it attacks. Another way of doubling it up is with some extra combat steps. This is where cards like Seize the Day, Hexplate Wallbreaker, Scourge of the Throne, and Fear of the Horde come in. Perfect for flinging a scary amount of damage to our opponents. Another way of going is with cards like Furnace of Wrath, Dictate of the Twin Gods, Fiery Emancipation, and Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight. These double or triple the amount of damage that our permanents do, again making us taking out our opponents so much quicker. A different way you can take the damage is with Tainted Strike. If we give the War Doctor Infect, you only need 10 time counters on it to just take an opponent out of the game. We even get a nice little combo with Abdel, Adrian, Gorion's Ward, and Animate Dead. Both of these cards are just perfectly fine in the deck anyway, but when they're combined, we effectively have a game-winning combo. You do need Abdel in the graveyard, but you can then cast Animate Dead, bringing Abdel back into play. Abdel then exiles the Animate Dead, meaning we make a 1/1 and put a time counter onto the War Doctor. Because the Animate Dead is exiled, Abdel will then die. When it does, Animate Dead comes back into play. Its effect goes on the stack and you bring back Abdel into play. You can effectively repeat this infinitely, making an unlimited board of 1/1 soldiers and putting infinite time counters onto the War Doctor. Pretty snazzy. Rounding off the deck with some utility lands, as for 3 colours we're not going to be running too many. Rogue's Passage is always a great place to start, as importantly it can make our commander unblockable, so we're always able to swing through. We then have Khan's Bastion, which is just basically a mana sink that we can use to tick up our time counters all the higher. You then have Spinerock Knoll. Hideaway lands are always pretty good in Commander, but in this deck not only does it exile a card, meaning we get a counter, but also getting to 7 damage will be really easy with the ping effect as well. Then lastly, you have Bojuka Bog and Scavenger Grounds. Nerfing a graveyard deck is always solid, but the fact that they add a counter to the War Doctor when they do is all the better. Right, thank you all very much for watching. Do let us know down in the comments if there's any other commanders from the Doctor Who Universes Beyond you'd like us to take a look at. If there's any other cool Doctor companion pairings that you would like to see, let us know, we'll check them out. But anyway, until next time, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.